Fatal confession. She didn't realize she was married to a monster. Criminal story. Julia had always believed that her life was a reflection of everything she had ever wanted. She often thought back to when she was a little girl, imagining what her future would be like. Her dreams were always simple: a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a life that felt secure and peaceful. When she married Daniel 6 years ago, it felt as though those dreams had finally come true. Their life together seemed perfect in every way, and Julia often marveled at how lucky she was. It was as if she had won the lottery of life, finding the perfect partner, a man who seemed to be everything she had ever dreamed of. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. They lived in a picturesque suburban neighborhood, a place where the streets were lined with old oak trees and the houses looked like something out of a storybook. Their home was a cozy, two-story house with a red brick facade and a front porch that overlooked a well-kept garden. Every detail of their life together felt curated, carefully chosen to reflect the image of happiness and success. The walls of their home were adorned with photographs, their wedding day, their travels together, family gatherings, and moments of quiet joy. The house was a sanctuary for Julia, a place where she felt safe and loved. Daniel, too, seemed to embody the perfect husband. He was tall, with dark hair that was always neatly styled, and a warm, easy smile that could disarm anyone. He had a steady job as a lawyer, and though his work hours were long, he always made time for Julia. They would often take weekend trips to the countryside or spend lazy afternoons in the park, enjoying each other's company. He was always thoughtful, surprising her with little gifts, flowers on a random Tuesday, or a favorite book she had mentioned in passing. If she didn't confront him, if she didn't expose him, she was complicit in his lies. And she couldn't do that. She wouldn't. The moment Julia heard the front door open, her heart skipped a beat. Daniel was home. She had to do this now. There would never be a perfect time, never an easy moment to break the silence. The dread in her stomach clawed at her, but she steeled herself, feeling an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest. This wasn't the woman she had been yesterday. Yesterday, she had been blind to the truth. Today, she was ready to face it head-on. Daniel stepped into the house, his familiar voice drifting through the hallway as he called out to her. "Jules? You home?" His voice sounded so normal, so calm, as though nothing had changed. His words were a stark contrast to the storm that raged inside her. Julia stood up, the journal still in her hands, and walked toward the kitchen. She could hear Daniel's footsteps getting closer, the sound of his coat being shrugged off, the rustle of his shoes against the floor. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment, she felt the urge to run, to flee, to lock herself away from the confrontation that was coming. But she didn't. She couldn't. She had to face him. "Hey, there you are," Daniel said, smiling as he walked into the kitchen. His expression faltered when he saw the way she was holding herself, tense, on edge. "You okay?" His voice had a certain softness to it, a tenderness that had always made her feel safe. But now, the words sounded hollow. They felt fake. Julia opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head, but now that it was here, the enormity of what she had to say seemed insurmountable. She couldn't find her voice. She just stared at him, feeling the weight of his gaze, the disarming charm he always wore so easily. "Jules?" Daniel repeated, his brow furrowing in concern. "What's wrong? You look distant." She shook her head, her breath shallow. "Focus," she told herself. "Stay focused." She wasn't going to let him disarm her. Not now. She took a deep breath and, with a voice that was steadier than she felt, said, "I found something today." The words hung in the air between them, thick with accusation. Daniel's expression faltered for the briefest moment, too quick for most people to notice, but Julia caught it. It was just a flicker, a shadow of unease that disappeared as soon as it had come. He stepped closer to her, as though to comfort her, but she took a step back, putting some distance between them. "What did you find?" His voice had lost its warmth, replaced by an edge that wasn't there before. Julia couldn't decide whether it was fear or anger that he was masking. Maybe it was both.
She didn't know.
But she felt something cold in the pit of her stomach, something deep and unshakable. "I found your journal," Julia said, her voice low but resolute. She saw his face harden at the mention of it, and for a moment, his eyes darted toward the drawer where she knew he kept it hidden. He was caught off guard, but only for an instant. In the next moment, he forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Jules, I don't know what you're talking about," he said smoothly, but Julia could hear the tremor in his voice. It wasn't the confident tone she had always known. It was defensive. And there was something else, something darker lurking beneath it. "What journal?" "You know exactly what journal," she replied, her voice gaining strength. She lifted it, holding it between them like a weapon. "I've read it, Daniel. I know everything. The things you've done, the things you've written about those women. How could you?" Her voice broke slightly on the last word, the anger and betrayal so overwhelming that it felt like a physical force crashing into her. Daniel's eyes flickered, but for a moment, there was nothing but coldness. Then, his face shifted, and the mask he had been wearing for so long began to crack. The smile was gone. In its place, there was something much more unsettling. "Julia," he said, his voice quiet but deadly calm. "You don't understand. You never have. You think you know me? You think you can just open something I've kept private for years and judge me?" He took a step closer, his body language shifting from casual concern to something more threatening. "You don't get it. It's not that simple." She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she watched him. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, was standing right in front of her, and he was dangerous. His eyes were dark, almost wild, and the way he was speaking sent a chill down her spine. There was no warmth in his voice now. There was only a coldness, an arrogance, a sense of entitlement that made her stomach churn. "You think those women were just nothing? You think it was all just for fun?" Julia's voice cracked with disbelief. "You think you can hurt people like that and get away with it?" "Nobody's going to believe you, Julia," Daniel said, his voice low and ominous. "You think anyone will care about some old diary? You don't understand. It was necessary. I had to do it. You just don't understand." His eyes were hard, unblinking, and for the first time, Julia saw the terrifying depth of his conviction. He truly believed his actions had been justified. Her breath caught in her throat. The man she loved was unrecognizable. The monster in front of her was a far cry from the man who had whispered sweet words to her in the quiet of their bedroom, who had held her hand in public like she was the center of his universe. "I don't understand," Julia repeated, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You're a monster, Daniel. You've hurt people. You've hurt me. I don't even know who you are anymore." For a moment, there was silence. A long, pregnant silence. Daniel's eyes were fixed on her, and she could see something shift behind them, something like panic, like the walls he had so carefully built were beginning to crumble. "Julia, please," he said, his voice softer now, though it was laced with something dangerous. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You don't want to do this." But Julia, finally seeing him for what he truly was, stood her ground. She wasn't going to let him control her anymore. She wasn't going to let him manipulate her into staying in this twisted, toxic web of lies. "I'm calling the police, Daniel," she said, her voice firm. "This ends now. You're not the man I thought you were, and I'm not going to be part of this anymore." Daniel's eyes flashed with fury. For the first time since she had known him, she saw his mask crack completely. His lips curled into a sneer, and he took a step toward her, his movements quick and dangerous. "You're making a mistake," he growled, his voice low and menacing. Julia's hand reached for the phone in her pocket. She wasn't backing down. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the empty house like a gunshot, and Julia's heart raced in her chest. Daniel had stormed out, leaving behind a trail of chaos and a thick sense of dread that hung in the air. He had promised, with a dark edge to his voice, that she would regret this. His threats lingered in the corners of her mind, whispering to her like a ghost, reminders that his anger was far from over. Julia had called the police after the confrontation, but by the time they arrived, Daniel was long gone. She had barely been able to explain everything, her words rushed and fragmented, as the full weight of what had just transpired began to crash over her. They had taken her statement, but there was little they could do without concrete evidence. The journal, which had been her weapon, had already been hidden again, tucked away in a drawer in the kitchen. The police officer who took her report had told her they would look into the matter, but Julia had known that the path ahead would not be easy. She had no proof that Daniel was the man described in the journal. The women, the crimes, the brutality, it was all written in the past tense, as if it were history, and the only people who could confirm it were the ones who were now gone, or worse, too afraid to speak out. The law couldn't help her. Not yet. She would have to do this on her own. The hours stretched into days into nights. Julia didn't know how to sleep. Her mind replayed the scene from the kitchen over and over. Daniel's face twisted with fury, his voice dark and menacing. She could still hear him. The words, the threats. "You don't want to do this," he had said. "You think I won't find a way to make you regret this?" Each time Julia closed her eyes, she saw his face. But it wasn't just Daniel anymore. It was the monster. The monster he had been hiding all these years. And in her dreams, he was always one step ahead of her. He was always just behind her, watching, waiting. No matter where she turned, he was there, lurking in the shadows. But this wasn't a dream. This was her reality now. And it was a reality she wasn't sure how to survive in. Julia knew, deep down, that she couldn't stay in the house. It had been their home, but now it felt like a tomb, a prison. Every room, every corner, every creak of the floorboards reminded her of everything she had learned, everything Daniel had done, and everything he was capable of. She couldn't stay there. But where could she go? Her friends were out of town. Her family, scattered across the country, had no idea what had happened. She couldn't turn to them. She couldn't burden them with the reality of what she had uncovered. Not yet. She needed time. Time to figure out her next steps. Time to figure out how to escape the web of lies Daniel had so expertly spun around her. That night, she packed a small bag, throwing in clothes, toiletries, anything that would get her through the next few days. She didn't even know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't be here anymore. It wasn't until the next morning that Julia began to truly process the magnitude of what had happened. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman who stared back at her, pale, exhausted, hollow-eyed. She looked like a ghost. She had never felt so small, so powerless, so lost. For the first time in a long time, Julia didn't know who she was anymore. She wasn't the wife of a charming, successful man. She wasn't the woman who had built a life with him, believing in their shared future. She wasn't even the woman who had once felt safe in her own home. She was just someone running from the past, running from the truth, running from him. But how long could she run? How long could she hide? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from a neighbor she had barely spoken to before, someone who had noticed Daniel's absence the night before. He had asked if everything was okay. At first, Julia had hesitated to respond, but now she realized that it might be her only lifeline. The weight of isolation was crushing her, and having someone to talk to, someone who could see her as more than just the scared wife of a violent man, was a small comfort. She typed out a quick response, her fingers trembling as she sent the message.
"I'm okay.
Just needed some space. Thanks for checking in." She immediately regretted it. She wasn't okay. She wasn't okay at all. But she couldn't let anyone know. Not yet. Not until she figured out what she was supposed to do next. Julia spent the day pacing around her temporary apartment. She had checked into a modest, no-frills hotel in a nearby town, a place she had found through a quick online search. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe for now. She kept the curtains drawn, afraid someone might see her, but more afraid that Daniel might be watching. He knew where she lived. He knew where to find her. Her stomach churned with a gnawing fear that wouldn't go away. By the time the sun set, Julia was exhausted. Her body ached with tension. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't quite organize, couldn't make sense of. Her pulse fluttered with anxiety. She needed answers. She needed to know what to do. But how could she move forward when she didn't even know what the truth was anymore? The one thing she did know was that she couldn't go back. She couldn't let Daniel pull her back into the life he had created for her, the life that had been built on lies, deception, and control. She wasn't safe in that life. She couldn't let herself go back to him. She couldn't let him get away with what he had done. To her, to those women, to everyone he had manipulated and hurt along the way. So, Julia did what she could. She started researching. She dug through old files on her laptop, looked up articles on the crimes Daniel had written about in his journal, tried to find anyone who had connected him to the past. But there was nothing. The internet didn't know Daniel the way she had. It didn't know about the darkness lurking behind his perfect facade. The man she had married was a master manipulator. He had covered his tracks so well that there was no paper trail, no evidence to connect him to the crimes he had committed. She was alone. And more than that, she felt utterly powerless. But Julia wasn't about to give up. As she sat there in that dimly lit hotel room, a new resolve began to form inside her. She might not have the police on her side. She might not have anyone else to turn to. But she had the truth. She had the journal. And she had herself. That had to be enough. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and fear. Julia didn't know what to do next. Should she go to the police again? Should she try to track down the women from the journal, find out if any of them were still alive, still willing to speak out? Or should she try to get as far away from Daniel as possible, disappear completely, and never look back? The constant uncertainty was gnawing at her, but there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him keep controlling her life from a distance. The only way to break free was to fight back, to fight for herself. Julia had spent her entire life playing the role of the perfect wife, loving, supportive, loyal. She had been so willing to play her part, so willing to fit into the life that Daniel had created for them, that she had lost sight of herself. But no more. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for the women whose voices had been silenced. She was fighting for the future, for her own future, and for the future of anyone who might be caught in the web of lies Daniel had woven. Julia knew that Daniel wouldn't stop. He wouldn't just let her go. And that meant she couldn't stop either. She had to be stronger than she had ever been. She had to find a way to survive this, to fight back, and to make sure that no one else ever had to live in the shadow of the monster he had become. Julia stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection with a hollow, distant expression. The dark circles under her eyes had deepened since the night she fled her home. She had only been able to sleep for a few hours at a time, often waking up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, with the image of Daniel's furious, twisted face burned into her mind. Yet, as she stood there now, something had changed. The tension in her body seemed to have reached a breaking point, a turning point. Her phone buzzed on the bathroom counter, and she instinctively reached for it. The screen lit up with a message from Detective Markham, the lead officer in the case, his words blunt but clear. "We've found evidence that might connect Daniel to a string of unsolved cases. It's time to move forward. He's not just your husband, Julia. We've got enough now to bring him in." A cold wave washed over her as she read the message again. The detective's words were a confirmation of what she had feared, but it also felt like a small victory. The investigation had moved forward, and for the first time since everything had unraveled, Julia felt a faint glimmer of hope. But it was tempered by something darker. She didn't know whether it was relief or dread that made her breath catch in her throat. After days of feeling trapped in limbo, this was the breakthrough she had needed. The police had finally found the evidence they needed to make a case against Daniel. Julia's gut told her that her husband wasn't just the manipulative, violent man from the journal. He was a monster with blood on his hands. The crimes he had committed were darker than she could have ever imagined, and the fact that the police now had something concrete to go on made her feel like she could finally breathe again. For the first time, Julia allowed herself to imagine a future without him. a future where she could find peace, where she could rebuild her life. She let out a long, shaky breath as she glanced at the phone again, the detective's message still glowing. But even as she began to entertain the possibility of a new beginning, something gnawed at her. What if the truth wasn't as simple as the police seemed to think? What if she had missed something? The nagging doubt, the uncertainty that had haunted her for so long, refused to let her go. The next morning, Julia sat in the modest apartment she had rented for the past week, her hands trembling as she placed the journal in front of her on the table. The leather cover felt like it was burning through her fingers. The journal had been her weapon, her lifeline, the key to exposing Daniel's lies, but it was also the catalyst for everything that had followed. It was the thing that had shattered her world, and now it sat in front of her like an ugly reminder of everything she had lost. She ran her fingers over the pages, flipping back to the entry that had started it all, the entry where Daniel had written about his violent past, about the women he had hurt and discarded. His words, written in cold, detached prose, had made her stomach turn. And now, more than ever, they seemed like a betrayal. She had believed in him for so long, trusted him with everything, and now she could barely recognize the man he had become. Julia had spent the past few days piecing together the fragments of his past, contacting old acquaintances, tracing the trail of lies he had spun over the years. What she had uncovered was more horrific than she could have ever imagined. But there was something that still didn't sit right. The journal had detailed the crimes, the violence, and the manipulation. Yet there was still so much that didn't add up. Had Daniel truly been able to hide his dark side for so long? Or had he just been smarter, more calculated than she had ever realized? Her mind wandered back to the night of the confrontation when she had demanded answers from him. He had admitted to the crimes. He had been so calm, so cold. It was almost as if he had been prepared for her to find out.
But why?
If he was truly guilty, why hadn't he fled? Why hadn't he tried to cover his tracks more thoroughly? Why had he allowed himself to be so careless? Her mind couldn't stop turning over these questions, even as she pushed herself to focus on what was important: getting Daniel arrested, exposing the truth, and getting justice for the women he had hurt. And now, after weeks of uncertainty, the police finally had the evidence they needed. Detective Markham had said it was time to move forward. But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story, something lurking beneath the surface. The police might have enough to bring Daniel in, but was that really enough to stop him? Was it enough to keep him from coming after her? Julia sat in a small, sterile interrogation room at the police station, the walls closing in around her.
Henne.
V's were on edge. Detective Markham had told her that Daniel was going to be arrested today, that they were moving forward with the charges. And yet, she couldn't help but feel like something was about to go terribly wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel had one more trick up his sleeve. The door opened, and Markham stepped inside, his face grim. He was carrying a folder, which he set down in front of her on the table. Julia's heart thudded in her chest as she met his eyes. There was something about his expression, something dark and unreadable, that sent a chill down her spine. "We've got him, Julia," Markham said, his voice firm, but there was an undertone of caution in his words. "We've been tracking his movements. He's been trying to cover his tracks, but we've got enough now to bring him in. We've got surveillance footage, witnesses who are willing to testify. We've got the journal. We've got it all." Julia's pulse quickened, but there was still a pit of doubt in her stomach. "You're sure he won't get away with this?" she asked, her voice tight. Markham nodded. "We've got him. It's only a matter of time now." But as he spoke, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be as simple as it seemed. Daniel had always been one step ahead. She had been blind to his manipulations for so long. How could she be sure he wouldn't find a way to worm his way out of this, just like he had done with everything else? He was too good at hiding in plain sight. That evening, Julia sat alone in her small apartment, her eyes fixed on the door. She had learned that Daniel had been arrested, but he wasn't broken. The authorities hadn't expected his reaction. They hadn't expected him to be so calm, so composed, as if he had been anticipating this moment for years. The phone call Julia had received from Detective Markham had been a strange one. Daniel had asked for a lawyer immediately. He had refused to speak to the authorities without representation, and he had gone into a state of eerie silence. As the days passed, Julia could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on her again. She had won a victory. Daniel was in custody. The police had the evidence to convict him, and she had finally done what she set out to do. But the victory felt hollow. She hadn't expected it to feel like this. It was as though the real battle had just begun. The police had told her that they were moving forward with the trial, that they had a solid case against Daniel. But as the weeks passed, Julia began to feel like she was sinking deeper into a hole of questions that still needed answers. Was he really guilty of everything he had written in that journal? Was there more to his story than anyone realized? The nagging feeling of doubt had resurfaced once more. The evidence was there, but something was missing, something she couldn't quite place. The trial was coming, and Julia knew that, despite everything she had uncovered, there was a chance that she still hadn't seen the full extent of Daniel's darkness. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Julia sat at the edge of the bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out the small hotel window at the dimly lit street below. The world outside seemed to move in slow motion, the passing cars leaving streaks of light behind them as they sped past. Her thoughts, however, were far from the night's tranquil scene. The past few weeks had been a blur, a whirlwind of police visits, interviews, and phone calls. But now, as the trial date approached, Julia found herself paralyzed by a deep sense of grief. It was a grief that she couldn't explain, one that had nothing to do with the loss of her safety or her home, but rather, it was the heavy, suffocating realization of the cost of the truth. She had done what she set out to do. She had uncovered Daniel's crimes, brought him to justice, and exposed the monster he had become. And yet, the victory that should have brought her peace instead left her feeling hollow and broken. There were no cheers, no triumphant moments, no sense of liberation. What she had hoped would be a release from the nightmare had, in fact, become a different kind of torment, one that she hadn't anticipated. The days leading up to the trial felt like a slow march toward an inevitable end, but it was the quiet, internal turmoil that was the hardest to bear. She had spoken to the detective only the day before, but her conversation with him had left her more unsettled than ever. He had reminded her of the evidence, of how strong the case was against Daniel, and that the likelihood of a conviction was high. But what no one could have prepared her for was how deeply she would feel the weight of the truth. What had started as an effort to expose a lie, to reveal the man she had once loved as the killer he was, had now stripped away any illusions she had held onto about her life, about herself. As she looked at her reflection in the darkened glass, she realized that she no longer recognized the woman who had married Daniel.
Who was she now?
She had built her entire life around a lie, and now, with that lie exposed, there was nothing left but emptiness. The sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand interrupted her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from the lawyer handling Daniel's defense, something she had been dreading. Despite everything, despite all the proof, the lawyer had found a loophole, a way to discredit her testimony. It seemed impossible that this could still be happening, but there it was. Her heart sank as she read the message. We've been informed that Daniel's defense team will be calling into question your mental state at the time of your accusations. They will argue that you are emotionally compromised after the confrontation and that you fabricated details from the journal. They believe you're seeking revenge, not justice. The words swam in front of her eyes. Julia's breath caught in her throat. She had expected this. Of course, Daniel would try to paint her as the unreliable witness. He would stop at nothing to control the narrative, even now. But knowing it was coming did little to prepare her for the sting of his betrayal. The very man who had manipulated her, controlled her, and caused her suffering was now trying to destroy her character, to make her the villain in her own story. It wasn't just the weight of the accusations that hurt. It was the realization that Daniel had always known exactly how to twist things in his favor. It was a game to him, a game he had been playing all along. The truth, his truth, was malleable, and he had crafted it so carefully that even the police, even the courts, were not immune to his manipulation. Julia set the phone down, her hands shaking. She stood up and walked to the window, pushing the blinds open slightly to look at the darkness outside. The city felt distant, as if she were watching it through a foggy lens. She had never felt so alone in her life. She thought of the people she had confided in, the few friends she had reached out to during the darkest days, and how they had all tried to reassure her, tried to make her feel that she had done the right thing. But now, as she faced the harsh reality of the trial, their words seemed distant. Their well-meaning encouragements had been hollow. None of them could truly understand the cost of what she had done. She thought of her parents, too, who had urged her to leave Daniel when the first signs of abuse had appeared, only for Julia to dismiss their warnings. She had believed in him, believed that the man she married was the man he truly was. But now, all the warnings, all the signs she had ignored, played in her mind like a twisted montage. She had been so certain that Daniel was the love of her life, the one person she could trust. And now, in the wake of the destruction he had caused, she realized how deeply she had allowed herself to be deceived. Not only had she lost the life she had known, but she had also lost herself in the process. The trial began in earnest a few days later, and as Julia took the stand, she was struck by the weight of what she was about to do. It wasn't the physical discomfort of sitting in the courtroom or the long hours spent answering questions. It wasn't the stares from the public, the way they whispered behind her back as if she were already guilty. No, it was the psychological toll that had become unbearable. She had always prided herself on being a composed, rational person, but in that moment, as she faced Daniel's cold, unfeeling gaze from the defense table, she felt every ounce of her resolve beginning to unravel. His eyes bored into hers, so confident, so sure of himself. She could see the gleam of calculated victory in them. He knew this was just another game for him. He knew how to twist her words, how to use her own emotions against her. He was already laying the groundwork for his defense, and it made her stomach churn. Julia's voice trembled as she recounted the details of her discovery, how she had found the journal hidden in the attic, how the words on the pages had shattered her understanding of who Daniel was. She spoke about the confrontation, about the terror she had felt, and how she had been forced to flee for her life. But as she spoke, she could feel the doubt creeping in. Every time she paused, every time her words caught in her throat, she imagined the defense attorney's cruel counterpoints. He would call her emotional, unstable, vengeful. He would accuse her of fabricating everything to get back at her husband. He would twist her every word. And that's exactly what happened. The defense attorney was sharp, relentless. He picked apart her testimony with ruthless precision, questioning her memory, her state of mind. Are you sure you're not just imagining the events of that night? Could it be that you're still in shock, misremembering the details? He asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Julia's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She fought to keep her composure, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of the accusation. Was he right? Had she been too emotional? Was she truly just a woman scorned, seeking revenge as they claimed? She felt the walls closing in. She wanted to retreat, to crawl back into herself, to escape the crushing weight of the questioning. But she couldn't. She couldn't let him win. As the trial continued, Julia found herself sinking deeper into a well of despair. Every piece of the life she had built was being dismantled in front of her eyes. She wasn't just losing the case, she was losing her sense of self, her identity. Everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and truth had been called into question. Daniel's lies had taken root in every corner of her existence, and now, even the truth felt distorted. The days following the trial were some of the darkest Julia had ever known. Daniel's defense had shaken her, and she couldn't stop replaying his lawyer's words in her head. It didn't matter that the truth was on her side. It didn't matter that the journal, the evidence, and the testimony of witnesses all pointed to Daniel's guilt. The battle she had fought to expose the truth now seemed pointless. Every step forward only revealed another layer of loss. Julia sat in her small apartment, the weight of the world pressing on her chest. The trial wasn't over yet, but it had already taken everything from her. She had paid the price for seeking justice. She had lost her sense of security, her trust in herself, and even her faith in the legal system. But the greatest loss was the realization that, in exposing Daniel for what he truly was, she had to confront the monster inside herself, the one who had allowed herself to be manipulated for so long, the one who had been complicit in his lies. In the end, it wasn't the courtroom that had broken her. It was the truth. The courtroom was silent as the final verdict was read aloud. Julia sat stiffly in the front row, her body tense with anticipation, her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest. The judge's voice echoed in her ears, but the words seemed distant, distorted, as if they were coming from somewhere far away. For a moment, she thought she might faint. The weight of the past few months had been too much for her to bear, and the culmination of the trial, the moment she had so long anticipated, was now unfolding before her eyes. "Guilty," the judge announced, the words slicing through the air like a knife. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but Julia remained still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't feel any sense of relief. It wasn't the victory she had hoped for. It wasn't the freedom she had imagined when she first discovered the truth about Daniel. She had spent so long fighting for justice, so long yearning for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt like a hollow, empty victory. Daniel's expression, cold and unreadable, remained unchanged as the verdict was read. He had been sentenced to life in prison, and yet, as the officers approached to escort him away, Julia could still feel the same sense of dread she had felt the moment she had confronted him all those weeks ago. His gaze met hers briefly, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition, perhaps, or a flash of anger. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the dull, unfeeling mask of the man she had once called her husband. As the court session adjourned, Julia slowly rose to her feet. She felt disoriented, her body heavy as if the weight of everything, the years of manipulation, the abuse, the lies, was now pressing down on her all at once. She had done it. She had brought Daniel to justice. She had exposed his crimes, confronted him, and ultimately, she had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something, the closing of a chapter in a life she had once known. She could never go back to the person she had been before she found the journal. That woman, the one who had trusted, loved, and believed in Daniel, was gone, erased by the revelation of his true nature. The months following the trial were a blur of change. Julia moved away from the city, leaving behind the house that had once been her home, the home where she had spent so many years in the false comfort of a life built on lies. The house, once filled with the illusion of love, had become a prison. The walls that had once been a sanctuary now felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with memories of the man she had trusted and the horrors she had uncovered. She couldn't stay there. She couldn't bear to be reminded of the life she had lost. She found a small apartment in a quiet town, far from the life she had known. The change was jarring at first. The unfamiliar streets, the absence of the constant noise that had surrounded her for years, the stillness, it all felt like a strange new world. It was as though she were starting over, but in the back of her mind, she knew that starting over wasn't something you could simply do. You couldn't erase the scars, the wounds that Daniel's betrayal had left behind. They were part of her now, etched into her soul in a way that no amount of time or distance could ever undo. The first few weeks in the new apartment were the hardest. Julia found herself waking up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, as though the darkness itself were closing in on her. The nightmares still came, haunting her with images of Daniel's face, cold, calculating, and always just a step ahead. She had been so sure, so convinced that the truth would set her free. But now that the truth was out, she found herself questioning everything she had known. What had it all been for? What was the point of exposing Daniel if it didn't bring her the peace she had so desperately sought? It wasn't just the trauma of the trial or the years of manipulation she had endured. It was the loss of everything she had built her life around. Julia had been so focused on uncovering the truth, on fighting for justice, that she had failed to see the deeper cost. She had lost her marriage, yes, but she had also lost her sense of self, her trust in the world around her, and the belief that she could ever truly feel safe again. How could she trust anyone after what Daniel had done? How could she trust herself? Julia spent the following months in quiet reflection, trying to piece together the parts of herself that had been torn apart by her marriage to Daniel. She began to see a therapist, someone who could help her navigate the depths of her trauma, someone who could help her understand that the guilt she carried was not her own to bear. It was Daniel's guilt. But the road to healing was long and winding, and Julia found herself taking one step forward and 2 steps back. The therapist, Dr. Green, was kind, patient, and non-judgmental. She helped Julia explore the complex emotions that came with surviving a relationship built on lies and violence. Julia learned about the psychological concept of trauma bonding, how victims of abuse often form an emotional attachment to their abusers, despite the harm they cause. This revelation shook her to her core. It was hard for her to admit that, for so many years, she had been emotionally dependent on Daniel. She had been so isolated, so deep in the web of his manipulation, that she hadn't realized the full extent of the damage he had done to her sense of self. Dr. Green encouraged Julia to take small steps in rebuilding her life. She advised her to focus on reclaiming her autonomy, learning to trust herself again, and rediscovering the things that brought her joy before Daniel entered her life. It was a slow process, one that required patience and self-compassion. Julia had to learn that healing wasn't linear. There were days when she felt like she was making progress, and others when the weight of her past felt unbearable. Over time, Julia began to regain a sense of peace. She started taking long walks in the nearby park, something she hadn't done in years. She began reading again, something she had always enjoyed before her marriage had consumed her. She reached out to old friends, reconnecting with people she had distanced herself from during her marriage. Slowly, her world began to expand beyond the confines of the trauma that had once defined her. It was as though she was rediscovering the person she had been before Daniel, but with the wisdom and strength that came from surviving the horrors of her past. She also began to volunteer at a local women's shelter, offering support to other survivors of abuse. Helping others gave her a sense of purpose that she had been lacking. It reminded her that she was not alone, that there were others who had experienced the same kind of pain and betrayal. It also helped her put her own healing into perspective. By giving back, Julia felt like she was reclaiming something important: her power. She had been a victim once, but she was no longer powerless. She was taking control of her life again, step by step. As the months passed, Julia found herself changing in ways she had never anticipated. She had started out as a woman who had been shattered by betrayal, but now, she was learning to rebuild herself from the ground up. She no longer defined herself by her marriage to Daniel or by the trauma he had inflicted on her. She was not the woman who had been deceived and destroyed. She was someone new, someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The truth, the one she had fought so hard to expose, had not set her free in the way she had imagined. It had taken her to the brink of despair, forcing her to confront the darkest parts of her past. But it had also set her on a new path, one that led her toward healing, self-empowerment, and the slow process of rediscovering who she was outside of her relationship with Daniel. Julia had been to hell and back. And while the scars of her past would always be with her, they no longer defined her. She had returned to her familiar situation, a life in the quiet town, away from the chaos of her former life. But she was no longer the same woman who had fled her home in fear. She was different now. She was stronger. She was whole. And for the first time in a long time, Julia allowed herself to hope. She knew the road ahead would not always be easy, and there would be times when the past would resurface. But she also knew that she was capable of moving forward, of building a life that was her own, one that was no longer defined by the man who had once claimed to love her. The truth had set her free, not in the way she had expected, but in a way that was far more profound. It had forced her to face her fears, to confront the darkness, and to emerge from it stronger than before. The journey was far from over, but Julia had learned one important thing: she could survive. She could rebuild. And perhaps most importantly, she could live again.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.